This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
Hello. We're going to talk about laws and regulations and responsibilities in respect of them. Laws and regulations, a very wide-ranging topic because companies are bound by laws that directly affect them and can directly affect the financial statements, things like the Local Companies Act legislation. They're also affected by other laws which might have an impact on the financial statements. As with fraud, of course, the responsibility for compliance with laws and regulations has to rest with management. So let's just start off here by saying it is management who are responsible, again, in terms of making sure they don't get into a mess through not complying with laws and regulations. Remember, TCWG is those charged with governance. That's the upper tier of management. Those charged with governance. I would always type that in full in the exam, but it's important to remember you've got that upper tier in the management structure. Notice as well the acronym here, NOCLAR, non-compliance with laws and regulations. So management are responsible for making sure the company does not break the law. Does the auditor get involved? Well, yes, a little bit. The auditor, as you know, is only concerned about the financial statements. And therefore, the auditor is concerned if the breach of the law actually impacts the financial statements directly or indirectly. Now, these phrases, directly and indirectly, are important. Directly, as it says here, means that it's something that dictates the way in which the financial statements are constructed. So this would be things like the local company legislation. So it may be that the company's legislation, the Companies Act in a particular country says you must produce a profit and loss, you must show this disclosure for directors or charges on asset and so on. So the auditor is concerned about things that directly affect the accounts, and it would be highly embarrassing if they didn't know exactly what the law says. So notice here, effectively again, that if it is something that directly affects the accounts, they must go out and do a full audit. They must obtain sufficient appropriate evidence. Do you see this phrase here? So it's something that directly affects the accounts. You must get full evidence, sufficient enough, appropriate, relevant and reliable. So these phrases go together, don't they? There are other laws and regulations, though, that won't really dictate the format of financial statements, but could have an impact. And that's why we also talk about things that indirectly affect the financial statements. So if you are a college, you're worried about health and safety. If you train apprentices who get some kind of support from the government, you're probably concerned about certain government regulations. If you're an airline, you're concerned about regulations of the airline travel industry. And the point is that if the company breaks the rules, they will get into trouble. If they get into trouble, they will get fined. If they get fined, and they'll probably have to pay the money, that puts you in the accounting area of provisions, or possibly contingent liabilities. So as it says here, if there is a breach of environmental regulations or something like that, in that case, the auditor is concerned because it would impact the financial statements. Now, things like these, remember, if you're probably going to have to pay for them, it means the company should recognize a provision. And if you're possibly going to have to pay for them, they will have to disclose a contingent liability. So what can the auditor do? Certainly, the company legislation they need to know inside out. But how on earth can they have the impact of a lawyer, the knowledge of a lawyer in every single field? So I'm an auditor. I know a lot about my local Companies Act. I'm auditing a school. I don't know the detail of the Health and Safety Act, the Education Act, and so on and so on. So what is my responsibility? My responsibility of auditor, to be honest, is actually a bit like when you're dealing with a child and their homework. You say, "Child, what is your homework?" And they say, "I have to write an essay." And then later in the evening you say, "Child, have you done your homework?" And they say yes. And you probably then say, "Show me the homework." Now, as long as you're familiar with the legislation in very outline, you ask the questions, you perhaps look at correspondence files to back up what you've asked, then your responsibility is satisfied. So notice here, when we talk about indirect responsibilities, again, it is much more of a limited responsibility. So I'll just draw an arrow down here. And in particular, the sorts of things that you would want to do is, as I said, have discussions with management. Again, have discussions with management. Review correspondence files with regulators. So it's those kind of things. Review correspondence files with regulators. But very much, you don't need the same detail of work as you perhaps would if you were doing sufficient appropriate evidence. I think some candidates in the exam think the auditor is the police, and therefore, should they find anything wrong in the business, a breach of regulation, they should don a uniform and take some handcuffs, arrest management, throw them into prison and report it in the audit report. That is just not the truth. The only thing that matters is that the accounts are right. Now, you've talked about audit reports in other chapters, but as it says, non-compliance only reported if it's going to have, for example, a material effect on the accounts. The likelihood is it probably won't close the business down. It could do. It could be going concern. But in many cases, the likelihood, I suspect, is that they've got unrecognised provisions. So when it says here, not adequately reflected, e.g., unrecognised provisions, in which case you may have to say the accounts are fine except for the omission of this provision, so qualified opinion. So looking back, what's the main thing for you to appreciate? The main thing in terms of a knowledge question is, what are the responsibilities of management and the auditor? And in respect of the auditor, it depends whether these things directly automatically impact the accounts. like the Local Companies Act, or indirectly like breach of health and safety. And there is laws and regulations.